This constitutionalism discussion is on page 24. You can just leave it right there. No. Constitutionalism on page 24. And let's just define this concept. Constitutionalism basically means that the monarch will be checked by constitutional agreements. In other words, there will be laws and agreements that will be made that will limit the power of the monarch. In other words, these laws and agreements we'll call a constitution. Now, England does not have a written constitution, one that begins with "we the people" and that ends with a series of articles that express exactly what rights the people have and what, and exactly what powers the government has. That is an American thing. Some American colonies developed constitutions. Later, the American government in 1787 develops the Constitution. England's constitution is unwritten. But the king is limited by all these laws and agreements that are made, and so those collectively make up the Constitution. Okay? So whereas absolutism is resulting in more power in the monarch, constitutionalism is sort of a different trend that limits the powers of the monarch. And so we can view France and England, therefore, as being on different political journeys. Part of the reason why England can do this is because it's an island, it's separate from the continent. So let's look at what goes on. Now, for remembering this era, it's useful to remember exactly the order. So if you remember, the 1500s, before this time period, we've got Henry VIII at the beginning, and then we've got, Edward and Mary, they're very brief, and then we've got Elizabeth at the end. So this is the 1500s. You basically need to remember 4 people, and 2 are giants, very important, and then these 2 people in between, right? And we discussed this when talking about the Reformation and the changes in the Church of England. So that's the 1500s or the 16th century. So constitutionalism is a trend that happens in the 17th century in England. What we'll see is that twice during the 17th century, Parliament will say to the king, no. And both result in these revolutions against the king. The first revolution turns into what's called the English Civil War and leads to chaos in Cromwell. The second revolution is the Glorious Revolution of 1688, where William and Mary come to power. And remember, they call it the Glorious Revolution, right? So it's branding.
History
glorious.
Is written by the victors.
History is written by the victors. So let's understand the order then that happens in the 17th century or in the 1600s. What was so funny?
You looked at it like, how dare you jump to my head?
Okay. So in the 1600s, we are going to have Elizabeth dies in 1603. You do not need to remember that. Just know 1600. She pretty much dies. Okay. So then, going into the 1600s, then it's going to be after Elizabeth. So we're going to have a very easy. I think the term is palindrome, right? It goes J C C C J William and Mary.
It's not a palindrome.
Isn't it? When it's the same thing back and forth?
Yeah, but Jesus Christ craves cracking jokes. That's how I remembered it.
Jesus Christ craves cracking jokes.
Or
Bailey's.
Jesus Christ creates Cracker Jacks for William and Mary.
Jesus Christ creates Cracker Jacks. That's a lot of CRs. That's a, Jesus Christ creates Cracker Jacks for William and Mary. Okay, so these are the suggestions. Okay. So, and then to remember this, like who's who, so if you get a question about this stuff on the test, seriously write out JCCCJ, or G, and then William and Mary. And then write J1, C1, Cromwell, C2, J2. Okay, that middle C could stand for Commonwealth or Cromwell. right? Because Cromwell creates the Commonwealth, where he's Lord Protector, and we'll talk about that in a second.
Commonwealth.
Okay, the Commonwealth, that's good.
Not really.
So, now what's going on? After Elizabeth's long rule, there's some resistance to the king, or the monarch, in England. You know, the nobles are sort of want to ensure that they still have power. And James I and Charles I both have these absolutist ideas about the divine right of kings. So they want to be absolute monarchs. Okay? And James I will rule, often, you know, the king calls Parliament into session, and Parliament passes laws, and Parliament has the power, just like the States General in France, right? In order to raise taxes, they have to approve it. Parliament has to approve any changes in taxes. So both James and Charles are resistant to these powers of Parliament. And I think it's Charles who actually rules for much of his time without Parliament. He dismisses Parliament and doesn't call another one into session. Now, what happens is Charles makes a series of moves where it basically forces him to call Parliament into session. Charles is also more conservative religiously. And so there's fears that Charles is a secret Catholic. And Charles implements he creates a conservative Church of Scotland in the Scottish territories. And most of Scotland is Presbyterian, so most of Scotland is these Calvinist Reformed churches. And so there's an uprising in Scotland against Charles I. Now, this uprising in Scotland means that the Scottish, there's this rebellion, they actually invade England, and so Charles has to fight them, but Parliament refuses to levy the taxes and expand the army in order to fight the Scottish. Parliament instead demands that the king agree to their reforms. And amongst their reforms is that Parliament stays in session, that the king doesn't rule without Parliament. So the king doesn't like this, he dismisses Parliament, and then there's new elections, and the new Parliament that comes in is just as bad, you know, just as counter to Charles as the earlier one. And this new Parliament that's elected in 1640 is the beginning of the Long Parliament. They'll be technically in session from 1640 to 1660, although all of them won't make it. So this Parliament, when the king refuses to acquiesce to their demands, this Parliament will agree to the creation of its own army to counter the army of the king. And this Parliament will also side with the Scottish uprising against the king. And this is actually where, this is sometimes called the Puritan Revolution, because many people in this Parliament, many nobles in England actually have become Puritans as a way to resist the Anglican or the king-dominated Anglican Church, the Church of England. So some historians consider this also a war of religion, because we have the Puritans, Parliament, the Scottish Puritans, against the Anglican king and his side. So we've got that political dynamic, king versus nobles, the nobles in Parliament, and also that religious dynamic, Anglican Church of England versus Puritan and Presbyterian, right? Both Puritans and Presbyterians are Calvinists.